"Frank, for God's sake, can't you change? You smell like a furnace. My guests will think we live in a scrapyard." The words, sharp and cold as freshly cut steel, sliced through the cheerful chatter of the party. My wife Eleanor stood before me, her face a mask of polite disgust, her champagne flute held like a weapon. 40 years. 40 years I'd walked out of the US steel plant smelling of sweat, graphite and fire. It was the smell of the mortgage on this very house being paid. It was the smell of the tuition for our son's law degree. It was the smell of the capital that funded this catering, these flowers, and the diamond bracelet dangling from the wrist of the woman who now looked at me as if I were something she'd scraped off her shoe. All around us, her new friends, bankers and surgeons with soft hands and even softer smiles, pretended not to hear, but their eyes flickered towards us. In that moment, I wasn't her husband. I was a stain on her perfect, beige-carpeted life, a relic of a past she was desperate to bury. A cold, heavy silence fell in my own heart, a silence louder than the roaring blast furnaces I'd known my whole life. I had built this world for her, beam by heavy beam, and now she wanted to tear down the architect because she was ashamed of the calluses on his hands. Just as I was about to answer, to say something, anything, a low, guttural groan echoed from beneath our feet. It wasn't loud, but it was deep. A vibration that traveled up through the soles of my worn work boots and into my very bones. The crystal glasses on a nearby table trembled, their delicate ringing a sudden alarm in the strained silence. A woman gasped. My son, Mark, standing beside his mother, looked down at the polished oak floorboards, his face draining of color. A thin, spidery crack shot out from beneath the leg of the grand piano, a dark and ugly scar on the flawless surface Eleanor cherished so much. The world seemed to stop. The music, the laughter, her insult, it all hung suspended in the air, displaced by a single terrifying sound, the sound of a foundation giving way. A casa que construí com minhas próprias mãos parecia gemer sob novo peso. Não aquele do trabalho de uma vida, mas o de silêncio que crescera entre nós, tão sólido e intransponível quanto qualquer parede. My mind reeled back, not just minutes or days, but decades, to the searing heat of the mill. I was 18 when I first walked through those gates, a boy with nothing but strength in his back, and a promise to a young Eleanor that I'd give her a better life than our parents had. And I did. For 40 years I endured the 12-hour shifts, the blistering heat that made the air shimmer, the constant danger of molten metal and heavy machinery. Every paycheck went into a joint account. I watched that account grow as my body slowly broke down. I bought this plot of land. I helped the contractors lay the foundation, my knowledge of structural loads and stress points earning a grudging respect from the foreman. While I was pouring concrete, Eleanor was poring over design magazines. While I was welding support beams, she was picking out curtains. It was our dream, or so I thought. Then Mark went to college, then law school. We were so proud. But with his success came a new circle of friends for Eleanor. Richer friends. Friends who didn't have grease permanently etched into the lines of their hands. Slowly, the woman I knew began to disappear. She started correcting the way I spoke. She'd ask me to use the back door if I was coming home from a shift when she had company. Last week, when she told me about this party, a fundraiser for some charity she'd recently joined, she said it was the most important night of her social life. "Please, Frank," she'd begged, "just for one night, try to fit in." I had tried. I showered. I put on my best slacks and a clean shirt. But before coming out, I had to fix a loose railing on the deck, a small task that left a faint sheen of sweat on my brow and the familiar, faint scent of my workshop on my clothes. It was all the ammunition she needed. The silence that followed the groan of the floorboards was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was worse than the shriek of the mill's machinery, worse than the deafening roar of the blast furnace. Those were honest sounds, the noise of work and creation. This was the sound of my world cracking. I didn't wait for Eleanor's look, the one that would be a mixture of horror, and vindication. I just turned, my dress shoes feeling alien and clumsy on the polished hardwood, and retreated. The basement door was my sanctuary gate. I closed it behind me, the solid click of the latch a more comforting sound than any of the hollow laughter upstairs. The air changed instantly. It was cooler, and it smelled of things I understood. Machine oil, sawdust, the faint metallic tang of the welding rig I'd used to reinforce the foundation. This was my cathedral. The fluorescent light flickered to life, humming a familiar, steady song, illuminating the ghosts of my labor. The workbench I'd built from solid oak, its surface a topographical map of nicks, stains, and decades of projects. The pegboard wall, where every wrench and screwdriver hung in its ordained place, a testament to order. My hands, still trembling with a cocktail of rage and shame, found a greasy rag and began to wipe them clean. But the grime was etched deep, a permanent tattoo in the creases of my skin, a history Eleanor wanted to whitewash. I looked at those hands in the stark light. They were a roadmap of my life. The thick, ropey veins, the calluses that felt like worn leather, the faint, silvery scar on my thumb from a mishap with a sheet metal cutter 20 years ago. These hands had held Eleanor when she cried after her father died. They had held my son, Mark, teaching him how to throw a baseball, how to swing a hammer. They had poured the very concrete that now formed the foundation of this house, my fingers tracing the wooden forms to ensure a perfect level pour. I had built this, not just the structure but the life within it. Every paycheck, a brick, every overtime shift, a layer of mortar. And for what? To become a ghost. A specter to be ushered in through the back door, a dirty secret in my own home. The bitter taste of irony filled my mouth, so potent I could almost choke on it. The house itself was failing, groaning under the weight of the very life it was built to contain. The foundation I had laid with such meticulous care was protesting the superficial world built upon it. It felt like the universe had crafted the perfect, cruel punchline, and I was the butt of the joke. I walked over to the far wall, where the blueprints for the house were still rolled up in a cardboard tube. I pulled them out, the paper crackling, the lines and numbers a language I spoke fluently. I had pored over these with the contractors, my finger tracing load-bearing walls and stress points. That beam needs to be a 6x8, not a 4x6, I'd told the foreman, a man named Joe with a skeptical squint. He'd scoffed until I showed him the calculations on a scrap of paper, the math of strength and endurance I'd learned not from a textbook, but from a lifetime of keeping immense, violent forces in check. He'd looked at me, then at the paper, and given a slow, respectful nod. You know your stuff, old-timer. Here, I had earned respect. Upstairs, I earned barely concealed disdain. My gaze fell on a small, dusty project tucked under the workbench. It was a wooden birdhouse. A simple A-frame I'd been building for no one in particular, just for the quiet joy of making something. It was crude, honest, nothing like the sleek, minimalist furniture Eleanor had filled the house with, all sharp edges and cold surfaces. A soft creak on the stairs made my shoulders tense. It wasn't the heavy, confident tread of a guest. It was hesitant. The door opened slowly, and Mark stood there, still in his suit, his tie loosened. He didn't look like a successful lawyer in that moment. He looked like the boy who used to follow me around this very workshop, his eyes wide with wonder. "Dad?" he said, his voice quiet in the humming stillness. I just grunted, turning back to the blueprint, pretending to study a detail I had long since memorized. He came down the rest of the way, his dress shoes scuffing on the concrete floor. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "Mom's, she's really upset. She's embarrassed, that's all. This charity thing, it's important to her. You get used to it. It's a language I never learned, and apparently I'm not worth teaching." He hadn't known I'd heard him say that to his mother a few weeks prior, a hushed, pragmatic suggestion that had felt like a knife to the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth, solid and unyielding as a steel beam, stood between us. In that moment, the low groan of the house settling was louder than any party. It was the sound of my foundation, the one made of concrete and sacrifice, finally, irrevocably, shifting, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the cracks were no longer just in the floorboards above. They were in me. The cold spark in my gut flared into a frigid, consuming fire. I stared at the addendum, the neat, bureaucratic script of the contractor, and the elegant looping signature of Eleanor. My Eleanor. A signature I'd seen on 1,000 birthday cards and grocery lists, now signing away the bones of our home. Laminated wood. For the main support beam, beneath the main hall where right now 50 people were laughing and clinking glasses, their weight a careless, collective burden. My practical knowledge, the thing she'd sighed over, the thing that made my hands rough and my conversation dull, began calculating load-bearing stresses with a grim, automatic efficiency. The numbers were not kind. The roar of the party above faded into a distant, meaningless hum. All I could hear was the memory of sound, the shriek of the steel saw at the mill, the thunderous groan of a fresh I-beam being set into place, a sound of permanence, of safety. I had spent 4 decades trusting steel. I had come home smelling of it, a metallic scent embedded in my pores that no soap could erase. And she had traded it for pressed wood and glue to frame a piece of polished stone. A bitter laugh escaped me, a dry, cracking sound in the dusty silence. Mark had been wrong. It wasn't subtext. It was physics. You could paint over a crack. You could lay the finest Italian marble over it. But the floor remained, growing, deepening, waiting for the right amount of pressure to bring it all down. All of it. The laughter, the music, the crystal, the carefully constructed life. I let the blueprint roll shut with a snap. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence I'd been reading my whole life. I looked at my workbench, at the familiar landscape of my irrelevance. The jars of nails, the loyal hammer, the sawdust covering everything like a fine snow. This was my kingdom of the tangible, and it had just handed me the one undeniable truth. I didn't storm upstairs. There was no rage left for that. The exhaustion I'd felt with Mark was now a complete and total vacuum, a stillness at my core. I climbed the basement steps slowly, each creak of the wood a personal accusation. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. The party swirled around me, a kaleidoscope of silk and perfume. No one noticed me. I was part of the scenery, the worn-out fixture in the background. My eyes went past them, past the conversations and the performances to the floor. The magnificent veined Italian marble floor. I could see it now not as a surface but as a lid. A beautiful lid on a cheap coffin. I walked. I moved through the crowd like a ghost. My work boots silent on the stone. I headed for the main hall, my senses heightened, tuned to frequencies no one else could hear. I felt the faintest tremor through my soles, a vibration that was wrong. It wasn't the solid, dead feel of a properly supported structure. It was a live, nervous hum, a groan waiting to happen. I saw Eleanor then. She was holding court near the grand fireplace, a glass of champagne in her hand, her laugh a bright, silvery bell that used to make my heart stutter. Now, it just felt like a signal of a fundamental dissonance. She was the curator of this beautiful, fragile lie. She had chosen the visible trophy over the invisible strength. She had chosen the appearance of a foundation over the foundation itself. And in doing so, she had proven my point from the basement with a finality that left no room for argument. My world was simple. It was real. You build something, and it stands, or it falls. Her eyes met mine across the room. The brilliant smile on her face didn't vanish, but it stiffened, became a mask. She saw the blueprint tube in my hand, my dirt-stained fingers wrapped around it. A flicker of confusion, then a sliver of annoyance crossed her features. She was calculating the social cost of my intrusion. My rough hands in her smooth world. She excused herself from her group and started towards me, her walk a model of poised grace. Every step she took was on that marble, over that compromised beam. I didn't move. I just waited, the cold certainty settling in my bones. "Frank?" she said, her voice a low, careful whisper meant only for me. A whisper that had once held secrets and dreams. Now it held a warning. "Is everything all right? You look pale." I saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, a slow, dreadful sunrise. The color drained from her cheeks, the careful makeup suddenly a mask on a corpse. Her gaze flickered down to the floor for an instant, a tiny, telling gesture of guilt. "John, that was a necessary compromise," she whispered urgently, stepping closer. "The budget was stretched so thin, the marble for the foyer. It sets the tone for the entire house. It was an aesthetic imperative." The words were so foreign, so utterly divorced from the reality of a roof over one's head that I almost laughed again. I saw it all then, not as a single betrayal, but as the culmination of 1,000 small ones. The back door. The sighs when I tried to tell a story about the men at the mill. The way my opinions on anything beyond a leaky faucet were gently, firmly ignored. "Aesthetic imperative," I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air between us, as oily and foreign as the word subtext had been with Mark. I looked past her, at the crowd of people, at my son watching us from near the staircase, his face a mirror of his mother's confusion. I looked at the magnificent, treacherous floor beneath their feet. "This house," I said, my voice still quiet, but now carrying a weight that made her flinch. "This beautiful house of yours, Eleanor, it has a rotten core. I couldn't bear to be inside when this one finally fell." The cold night air didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a different kind of enclosure, one made of my own failure. I stood on the manicured lawn, the blueprint tube a cold cylindrical weight in my hand. From inside, the muffled thrum of a string quartet and the tinkle of laughter seeped through the grand oak door, a soundtrack to a world I'd financed but was never meant to inhabit. Aesthetic imperative. The phrase echoed in my head, a perfect, polished little coffin for our marriage. My first instinct out there in the dark had been a righteous one, to run back upstairs, grab Eleanor by her silk-clad arm, and drag her down to the basement, to point a trembling finger at the shoddy beam and scream the truth into her perfectly made-up face. But the memory of her contempt, that tiny, flinching gesture of guilt she'd displayed moments ago, stopped me cold. She wouldn't see a warning. She'd see a crude interruption. The clumsy flailing of a simpleton husband who couldn't appreciate the grand design. Her pity would be worse than her anger. The sorrow that had been my constant companion for months began to curdle, transforming in the chill air into something else entirely, a cold, hard, and terrifyingly calm resolve. I wouldn't let anyone get hurt. That was a line I would not cross, but I would no longer stand as the silent, stoic bulwark against the consequences of her vanity. I decided right there on the damp grass that I would use my knowledge not to prevent her party, but to orchestrate its spectacular, undeniable finale. I would let her arrogance build the trap, and I, the man who knew every joint and sinew of this place, would be the one to spring it. I didn't go far. I circled the house, my shoes sinking into the soft earth of her prized flower beds. Then her eyes found mine. Across the ruined room, through the confused throng of guests, her gaze locked onto me, standing still and separate in the archway. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked back, my expression a blank page upon which she could project her own dawning realization. In her eyes, I saw the flicker of a connection being made. The late nights with my blueprints, my quiet opposition to the rushed construction, my absence from the pre-party vanity. She was piecing it together, and the horror in her eyes was no longer for the house, but for me. My destination was the side portico, a shadowy alcove where the caterers had set up a temporary staging area for trash and empty bottles. It offered a direct, oblique view into the great room through a large arched window. I leaned against the cold stone wall, the blueprint tube tucked under my arm like a general's baton. I was no longer John the husband, or John the provider. I was an engineer awaiting the results of a stress test. The party swelled. More people arrived. The music grew louder, the laughter more forced and frantic. I watched the floor. My eyes, trained for decades to see the subtle signs of strain, were fixed on the junction where the new, showroom-fresh hardwood of the great room met the foyer's Italian marble. I was waiting for a tremor, a sigh, the faintest groan of protest from the compromised beam below. An hour must have passed. The cold had seeped into my bones, but I felt a strange, feverish heat on my skin. My plan, which had felt so solid and justified moments ago, now seemed monstrous. This was my house too. My name was on the deeds. My sweat was in the very concrete of the foundation. To willingly stand by and wait for its humiliation felt like a form of self-mutilation. Then I saw him. Thomas, breaking away from a conversation, walked across the great room toward the kitchen. He was heading for the exact spot under which the basement beam was most compromised. My breath hitched. No, not there. Go back. It wasn't a collapse, not yet, but a sudden, sickening dip. A long, jagged seam appeared in the polished hardwood, running from the foyer threshold right into the center of the room. The tremor was subtle, but enough to make a woman shriek, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the now slanted surface. The string quartet screeched to a halt. A profound, deafening silence fell, broken only by the faint, agonized creaking of the structure settling into its new, painful reality. I saw Thomas stumble, his face a mask of shock as he looked down at the fissure that had opened up at his feet. I saw Eleanor frozen near the piano, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was not yet for safety, but for the desecration of her perfect stage. I didn't move. I remained in the shadows, the architect of this moment. There was no triumph in it, only a hollow, aching vindication. The house was groaning, just as I knew it would, and I was outside, finally, listening to it fall. Consultando meus antigos manuais de engenharia, com uma calculadora na mão, determinei a capacidade de carga exata das vigas de qualidade duvidosa. Discretamente medi o peso do piano e das mesas do buffet. Tornei-me um fantasma na própria casa, observando os preparativos para a festa não como um marido, mas como um analista estrutural. Eu sabia exatamente quantos convidados e quanta mobília seriam necessários para levar o piso ao seu ponto de ruptura, não para desabar, mas para gritar em protesto. The calculations were my secret scripture. In the dead of night, while Eleanor dreamed of social conquests, I'd sit in my study, the blueprints spread before me like a surgeon's chart. I traced the lines of stress with my finger, feeling the phantom ache in the wood and steel. I wasn't just predicting a failure. I was conducting a symphony of strain. The grand piano was my crescendo. Placed with diabolical precision directly over the main support beam, they downgraded from a sturdy LVL to a cheaper laminated pine. The heavy oak buffet, laden with silver and crystal, was my steady bass note, and the guests, my oblivious orchestra, their collective weight the final necessary pressure. The night of the party, I was a phantom limb of the house itself. I felt the floor joists groan as the caterers rolled in the champagne tower. I heard the subtle protest of the subfloor when the pianist, a robust man with heavy hands, took his seat. Every laugh, every footfall was a data point in my grim experiment. I watched the crowd ebb and flow, a living, breathing load, and I guided it with subtle manipulations. A suggestion to a colleague to admire the view from the foyer. A pointed comment to a group about the exquisite cheese display near the piano. I was herding them, gently, inexorably, toward the epicenter of the flaw. A deep, visceral crack, like the spine of a great beast snapping, tore through the music and chatter. The sound was felt more than heard, but its effect was instantaneous. O parágrafo problemático foi removido conforme a sugestão. He looked toward Eleanor, a question in his gaze, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the floor as if it had personally betrayed her. The facade of the perfect hostess crumbled, replaced by the raw, unvarnished fury of a queen whose castle had just shown itself to be made of sand. Then her eyes found mine. Across the ruined room, through the confused throng of guests, her gaze locked onto me, standing still and separate in the archway. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked back, my expression a blank page upon which she could project her own dawning realization. In her eyes, I saw the flicker of a connection being made, the late nights with my blueprints, my quiet opposition to the rushed construction, my absence from the pre-party vanity. She was piecing it together, and the horror in her eyes was no longer for the house, but for me. A voice, loud and authoritative, cut through the murmuring. "Everyone, please. Move calmly toward the exits. Let's not crowd. The structure may be unstable." It was Frank, a civil engineer I'd always found pompous, now taking charge. He was herding people toward the French doors leading to the garden. The guests, a flock of startled birds in formal wear, began to shuffle toward the safety of the night air. They stepped over the fissure with a strange, reverent care, as if crossing a grave. I watched them go. This society I had never belonged to, fleeing the beautiful lie I had helped expose. I finally moved, not toward the exit, but deeper into the room. The floor groaned a warning under my weight, a personal complaint. I walked to the jagged seam and looked down into the darkness. It wasn't a wide gap, maybe an inch at its most pronounced, but it was a chasm. A puff of cold, damp air from the basement below whispered up, carrying the scent of raw earth and concrete, the true, unadorned soul of the house, finally breathing. I had given the house a voice. It had spoken its first painful word. And as I stood there, the last man in the ruined great room, I knew it wouldn't be its last. The email from Sal sat in my inbox like a planted bomb, its stark, all-caps subject line, "Do not use that space." A final verdict. He became my unwitting accomplice, the expert witness to a crime of arrogance I was about to expose. I printed his response, the laser jet toner smelling of finality, and tucked the sheet into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. It rested against my chest, a cold, hard truth over my heart. A shield against the champagne-fueled self-congratulation I knew the party would be. That slip of paper was my anchor in the ensuing hours. As Cynthia flitted through the pre-party chaos, a vortex of perfume and anxiety, I remained still. I watched the caterers lay out canapes like architectural models on silver platters. I observed the string quartet tuning their instruments, their harmonious scales a stark contrast to the dissonant groans I knew the house was capable of. Every laugh that echoed a little too loudly in the great room, every heavy-footed step from a guest admiring the vaulted ceiling, felt like a tick of a countdown clock only I could hear. When the first crack sounded, it wasn't the violent, shattering explosion the guests expected. It was a deep, resonant thrum, the sound a giant cello string might make if plucked once and left to vibrate into silence. It was a structural sigh. The tremor that followed was subtle, a shiver that traveled up through the soles of my patent leather shoes and into my bones. For a split second, nothing happened. The quartet soared on, oblivious. Then, the second crack, a sharper, more definitive snap, and the fissure raced across the floor. A black lightning bolt forking through the polished oak. The chaos that erupted was a study in human fragility. The carefully constructed masks of civility shattered faster than the crystal flute that slipped from a woman's hand. But my focus wasn't on the panicked flock. It was on Cynthia. Her gaze, wide with a horror that was rapidly shifting from the house to its architect, locked onto me. I didn't smile, I didn't frown. I was a monument to neutrality, and in her eyes I saw the dreadful puzzle pieces clicking into place. When Frank, the pompous civil engineer, started herding people toward the garden, I finally moved. I walked against the tide of sequins and silk, deeper into the wounded heart of the room. The floor groaned a personal complaint under my weight. I knelt by the jagged seam, a fissure no wider than my thumb, but a chasm in its implication. A puff of cold, damp air whispered up, the true, unadorned soul of the house exhaling after years of suffocation. It smelled of raw earth and the quiet patience of concrete. I stayed there long after the last guest had stumbled into the night, their frightened whispers carried away by the breeze. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling into its new, painful reality. This was the autopsy, and I was the lone pathologist. A sound from the doorway made me turn. It was Cynthia. She had shed her hostess persona along with her heels, standing in her stocking feet on the damaged floor. Her face was pale, her makeup smudged by tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. "You knew," she said. Her voice was flat, scraped raw of all its usual melodic inflection. I didn't deny it. I simply looked from her shattered expression to the crack at my feet. The house was always going to speak, Cynthia. I just helped it find its voice a little sooner. I even have a second opinion. I didn't reach for the paper in my pocket. It was enough that she knew it existed. Her face crumpled, not in sadness, but in a rage so pure it seemed to warp the air around her. "You arrogant bastard. You did this to humiliate me, to prove you were the smartest man in the room. It just didn't have the finale you expected." I kept my eyes locked on his. He was a financier. He understood liability, negligence, facts. The load-bearing calculations for this open-concept design were fatally compromised. I have documented proof that I warned against it. Repeatedly. The party was just the dynamic load that triggered the inevitable. He looked at his wife, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of accusation in his gaze, not for me, but for her. She was the one who had managed the architects, who had pushed for the faster, cheaper revisions. "We'll talk about this in the morning," he said, his voice low and final. He didn't look at me again. He simply put a hand on Cynthia's arm, a gesture that was less comfort and more restraint, and guided her from the room. I was alone again with the house. I walked to the wall and flipped a switch, killing the dazzling display of the chandelier. In the sudden, profound darkness, the house felt more alive than ever. The groans and ticks of its structure were its true voice, a lament for its broken bones. I had given it that voice. It had spoken its first painful word, and as I stood there in the dark, the scent of damp earth and fear hanging in the air, I knew the whispers of its collapse were only just beginning. The real noise, the legal and social aftershocks, would start at dawn. My first move was subtle. Knowing the weakest point was in the center of the room, I approached Eleanor with a feigned peace offering. I told her I'd seen a photo of a beautiful, heavy, solid marble ice sculpture a friend's son had made for events. I suggested it would be the perfect centerpiece, an elegant touch. I even offered to pay for it. My contribution to her perfect night. She'd looked at me with that familiar, cool suspicion, her eyes scanning my face for the trap. "An ice sculpture? Here? It seems a bit ostentatious for the theme," she'd said, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of dismissal. "Precisely why it's needed," I'd countered, my tone dripping with manufactured earnestness. "It elevates the entire affair, a statement of solidity, of permanence, a block of pure, unadulterated ice carved into something beautiful. It speaks of a foundation that can handle anything, even the weight of something so cold and magnificent." I saw the flicker in her eyes then, the vanity I'd banked on. She couldn't resist the idea of a statement, especially one that subtly praised the strength of her domain. She agreed, with the caveat that she would handle the payment. Of course she would. She couldn't have my name attached to the centerpiece, my generosity overshadowing her own. The night of the party, when the sculpture was wheeled in, it was everything I'd promised and more. A 4-foot-tall, intricately carved, abstract swirl. It glistened under the chandelier like a frozen diamond. It was placed with exacting precision on the reinforced oak table that stood directly over the compromised main support beam. I watched as the condensation began to form, a slow, cold sweat beading on its surface. Each drop that fell onto the polished wood was a tiny ticking clock. The guests arrived in a shimmering wave of silk and self-congratulation. I moved among them, a ghost in my own design, a quiet architect observing the stress test of his flawed creation. I noted the exact placement of every heavy-set financier, every group of laughing socialites clustered near the center of the room. I felt the floor give, just a fraction, a sigh of protest beneath the carpet when a particularly boisterous group gathered around the sculpture to admire it. They were all unwitting accomplices, their collective mass the dynamic load the equations had warned against. I made sure to be near Robert when the first distinct crack sounded. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was a sharp, wooden complaint, like a giant stepping on a twig. He was mid-sentence, boasting about a recent merger, and his words faltered. His eyes, for a split second, darted to the floor. "Old house," he mumbled to his companion, forcing a laugh. "Settles all the time." Conversations died mid-word. Laughter caught in throats. That's when I made my move toward Cynthia. She was standing by the fireplace, her face a pale mask of confusion. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I simply walked, with a calm that felt like a superpower, and took her arm. "Cynthia," I said, my voice low but clear in the sudden quiet. "I think we should step back. Now." My grip on her arm was firm, guiding her away from the epicenter, towards the relative safety of the archway to the foyer. It was as we cleared the center of the room that the third, catastrophic sound tore through the air. This one was a deep, splintering roar, the sound of a spine breaking. The floor in the center of the great room buckled, a visible wave rolling through the parquet. The marble ice sculpture, that beautiful, heavy anchor of my design, wobbled violently on its table. For a breathtaking moment, it seemed to defy gravity, a frozen angel about to take flight, before it tipped and crashed to the floor. It shattered not with a delicate tinkle, but with a wet, thunderous explosion of ice and water, sending a glacial shrapnel across the shoes and ankles of the screaming guests. The chandelier swung wildly, casting frantic, dizzying shadows, its light catching the panicked faces, the spray of water, the terrifying growing fissure in the floor. Plaster dust snowed from the ceiling. In the chaos, I held my ground, my hand still on Cynthia's arm, a rock in a storm of her own making. I watched Robert's gaze travel from the crack in the floor to his wife's tear-streaked face, to my calm, resolute stance. His confusion was a tangible thing. "Robert," Cynthia began, her voice cracking, He sabotaged. He was a financier. He understood liability, negligence, facts. The load-bearing calculations for this open-concept design were fatally compromised. I have documented proof that I warned against it, repeatedly. The party was just the dynamic load that triggered the inevitable. He looked at his wife, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of accusation in his gaze, not for me, but for her. She was the one who had managed the architects, who had pushed for the faster, cheaper revisions. "We'll talk about this in the morning," he said, his voice low and final. He didn't look at me again. He simply put a hand on Cynthia's arm, a gesture that was less comfort and more restraint, and guided her from the room. I was alone again with the house. I walked to the wall and flipped a switch, killing the dazzling display of the chandelier. In the sudden, profound darkness, the house felt more alive than ever. The groans and ticks of its structure were its true voice, a lament for its broken bones. I had given it that voice. It had spoken its first painful word, and as I stood there in the dark, the scent of damp earth and fear hanging in the air, I knew the whispers of its collapse were only just beginning. The real noise, the legal and social aftershocks, would start at dawn. I didn't leave immediately. I let the silence and the dust settle around me. I picked my way through the debris, my shoes crunching on fragments of ice and plaster. I stood at the edge of the fissure, a dark, ragged smile in the moonless room. It was perfect, a clean break, a testament to a truth they had tried to bury under expensive finishes and social pretension. My work here was done. The seed of their ruin was planted, and it had already taken root in the cracked foundation of their lives. All that was left was to watch it grow. The morning after the collapse did not arrive with a gentle dawn, but with the percussive assault of a jackhammer. It was the sound of the city, of course, a road crew 2 blocks over, but to my ears, it was the opening salvo in the War of the Wentworths. I sat in my small, quiet apartment, the one Eleanor referred to as my pensioner's box, and sipped my tea. The silence here was genuine, a void, not like the pregnant, groaning silence I'd left behind in the mansion's carcass. My phone, a cheap, utilitarian thing, remained dark. The news, when it broke, would not come to me directly. I was a spectre at that particular feast, my name a forgotten footnote in the architectural appendices of their downfall. I was the original designer, the one whose impractical sentimentality had been so thoroughly and expensively revised. Let them remember that now. I didn't need a call to know how the morning was unfolding. I could picture it with the clarity of a film reel. Robert, his face a mask of controlled fury, would have been on the phone with his lawyers by 6 a.m., his voice a low, dangerous monotone. The words would be precise, legal, and utterly damning. Structural integrity, liability, gross negligence. He would be dissecting the financial corpse of the project, calculating the losses, not just of the repairs, but of the prestige. A man like Robert Wentworth's social credit is built on an image of unshakable stability. A cracked foundation is a crack in his very character. And Eleanor. My Eleanor. I imagined her still in her silk pajamas, the ones she'd once told me were a necessity for maintaining a certain skin pH. She would be hovering at the edges of the chaos, her grand vision for the evening replaced by the terrifying reality of the morning. The caterers would be calling to confirm delivery times for canapés that would never be eaten. The florist would be inquiring about the final placement for orchids that would now be arranged around a gaping chasm. Each ring of the phone, each ping of a text, would be another tiny detonation in the world she had so carefully curated. She was blinded by her own vision of grandeur and my apparent submission, and she had loved the idea of that sculpture. She had taken my meek suggestion, my feigned concern for architectural balance, and seen it as my capitulation. I could almost hear her voice, a conspiratorial whisper laced with condescension, as she scoffed privately to our son that I was finally learning my place. The irony was so rich, it was almost a physical taste on my tongue. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I was handing her the shovel to dig her own social grave. And oh, how she had dug. Emboldened by what she saw as my defeat and the impending triumph of her party, she had rented the heaviest, most obtrusive marble sculpture she could find, a hulking modernist thing that must have cost a fortune just to transport. It was to be the centerpiece, a testament to her impeccable, weighty taste. Its placement, directly over the compromised section of the floor I had subtly indicated with a worried frown weeks ago, was the masterstroke she never knew she was painting. Feeling invincible, she had then invited 10 more guests, bragging to her inner circle about the magnificent, unprecedented turnout she expected. She was setting the stage for her own humiliation perfectly, a playwright of her own ruin, with me as the invisible guiding hand. Every additional RSVP was another witness, another pair of eyes to see the plaster dust in her hair, another mouth to spread the delicious, scandalous news. She hadn't just tripped. She had arranged a gala event for her own fall from grace. By midday, my curiosity got the better of me. I took a walk, a long, leisurely stroll that just so happened to pass by their street. The scene was better than I could have hoped. 2 news vans were parked at a discreet distance, their satellite dishes raised like insects' antennae. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered behind the police sawhorses that now blocked the driveway, and there, in the center of it all, stood the house. In the unforgiving light of day, the fissure was even more dramatic. A black tarpaulin had been stretched over the hole in the roof, a pathetic bandage on a mortal wound. I saw Robert first, standing on the pristine lawn with a man in a hard hat, pointing at the roof, his body language a rigid exclamation point of anger. Then I saw her, Eleanor. She was being led by a uniformed police officer toward a black town car, a coat thrown over her shoulders despite the mild weather, a pair of oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes. But nothing could hide the slump of her shoulders, the way she held herself, as if trying to fold into invisibility. She looked small, insignificant. Just another wealthy woman in a scandal, her grandeur stripped away to reveal the terrified core beneath. I didn't smile. I didn't feel the hot rush of triumph I had expected. Instead, I felt a cool, deep satisfaction, as still and vast as a subterranean lake. The seed of their ruin was not just planted. It had erupted, a violent, public bloom of failure and shame. The whispers had become a roar. My work was, indeed, done. I turned and continued my walk, the sounds of their disaster fading behind me, just noise now. The real symphony was the quiet in my own head. The peace of a debt, finally, and exquisitely, paid. The night before the party, while the house was quiet, I descended to the basement. My goal wasn't to prevent the inevitable collapse, but to ensure it happened on my terms, without anyone getting hurt. I positioned 4 heavy-duty hydraulic construction jacks directly under the compromised wooden beams. They were perfectly hidden but ready. My plan wasn't just to let the floor fail. It was to demonstrate, in the most dramatic way possible, that I was the only one who could save it. The trap was now a stage, and I was its director. The air in the basement was cool and smelled of damp earth and old stone, a familiar scent that grounded me. Above, the grand house was a sleeping beast, its opulence a hollow shell. I ran my hand over the cold, greased piston of one jack, a stark contrast to the warm, polished oak it would soon support. My calculations were precise. The weight of the crowd, the specific weak points I had meticulously identified and subtly exacerbated over weeks, the exact pressure needed, it was all a perfect equation waiting for its final variable. I wasn't an agent of chaos. I was an engineer of consequence. The memory of Eleanor being led to that town car, shrunken and exposed, flashed behind my eyes. That cool, deep satisfaction I had felt then was back. But now it was a focused, humming energy. This wasn't just about their public shame anymore. That was the opening act. This was the main performance. Robert, with his bluster and his checkbook, believed he could buy stability, buy respectability. He was about to learn that some structures, once their integrity is gone, are beyond purchase. They can only be propped up by the very hands that understand their flaws. The party arrived on a wave of perfume and self-congratulation. From my designated post near the grand staircase, I watched the beast awaken. The chandeliers blazed, casting a deceptive warmth over the crowd. Laughter bubbled and spilled, a sound I found both grating and necessary. It was the sound of a height from which to fall. I nursed a glass of champagne, the bubbles like tiny detonations on my tongue. I made polite conversation, my answers automatic, my true attention tuned to a different frequency. The low, almost imperceptible groan of the house settling under its new, excessive weight. Then it began, not a crash, but a sound. A sharp, splintering crack from the living room, distinct as a gunshot even through the din of conversation. The music faltered. A wave of silence rolled out from the epicenter, followed by a collective, startled gasp. I moved with a purpose that must have looked like concern. Pushing through the frozen crowd, I arrived at the threshold. The scene was perfect. A section of the parquet floor, right in the center of the room, had visibly sagged, creating a shallow dish. A long, jagged crack ran through the intricate pattern of the wood. A woman had dropped her champagne flute. The crystal lay shattered in the depression, a miniature of the larger disaster. Robert was there, his face a thundercloud of confusion and dawning horror. He was staring at the floor, as if it had personally betrayed him. "This is impossible," he sputtered, looking around for anyone to fix the unfixable. The engineers, the reports. I simply stepped forward, my movements calm and deliberate. "Robert," I said, my voice cutting through the panicked whispers. "The basement, now." I flung the basement door open and flipped the light switch. The single bare bulb illuminated the scene I had staged. The 4 hydraulic jacks stood like obsidian monoliths, their bases firmly planted on the dirt floor, their tops pressed flush against the compromised beams overhead. They weren't just holding the weight, they were asserting their strength against the inevitable collapse. One of the wooden beams above them had split, a pale tongue of splintered wood visible against the dark grain. But it went no further. It was held, captured in the very act of breaking. Robert stumbled to a halt beside me, his breath catching. He looked from the jacks to the fractured beam, then back to me, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the image. The crowd at the door murmured, their whispers echoing in the cavernous space. "I told you the support structure was compromised," I said, my voice low but carrying. I gestured to the jacks. "I did what your engineers failed to do. I found the precise points of failure, and I installed these temporary supports last night. I knew the combined weight of your celebration would be the final test." The savior of his home, the man preventing a catastrophic collapse in front of his entire social circle, was the same person he had dismissed, the hired help he'd treated as an inconvenience. I hadn't just fixed a problem. I had engineered a scenario that proved my every warning correct, and his every decision foolish. His money was useless down here. His influence meant nothing to the laws of physics. The only thing standing between his world and ruin was my foresight, my knowledge, my silent, secret work. I looked at him, holding his gaze, letting him see the calm certainty in my eyes. There was no gloating, no smirk. That would have been a hot, fleeting thing. What I felt was that same vast, subterranean satisfaction, now surging up to fill the space between us. The debt wasn't just being called in. He was being forced to watch as I, the creditor, built the very stage upon which his insolvency was revealed. The performance was flawless. The director was taking his bow. The night of the party arrived, and I remained in my work clothes, the uniform of my life's sacrifice. As the guests filled the hall, a sea of silk and self-congratulation, I saw Eleanor making her way towards me, her face a thundercloud of fury cutting through the frivolity. The familiar scent of my workshop clung to my clothes like a ghost, and I knew what was coming before she even spoke. "Frank, for God's sake, can't you change? You smell like a furnace. My guests will think we live in a scrapyard." I simply absorbed it, letting it settle into the vast, quiet reservoir of my resolve. I saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes at my lack of reaction, the slightest tremor of confusion that I wasn't shrinking before her. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture so devoid of deference it felt like a physical blow. Then I turned my back and walked away, not in retreat, but in execution. The performance was about to begin. I moved through the periphery of their celebration, a phantom in my own life. I saw Robert, his face flushed with champagne and borrowed importance, holding court. He was the architect of this triumph, the master of the house he'd merely purchased. I was the ghost in its machine, the grit in its bearings. I positioned myself near the grand archway that separated the ballroom from the older section of the house, my back against the cool, solid stone of the original foundation. I was a stagehand in the wings, waiting for the curtain to rise on the truth. The first sound was a soft, almost polite groan, a sound a giant might make turning in its sleep. The music faltered for a beat, the string quartet missing a note. A few heads turned, then turned back, dismissing it as a trick of the old house. Then it came again, louder this time, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to travel up through the soles of my shoes and into my bones. This was no trick. This was the voice of the house itself, finally speaking its mind. Panic is a subtle creature at first. It starts in the eyes, a widening, a dawning horror as the mind struggles to categorize a threat it cannot see. The music died completely. The laughter choked off. In the sudden silence, the next sound was unmistakable. The sharp, percussive snap of wood and the terrifying, continuous shower of plaster dust from the ceiling, a fine gray snow falling on black ties and bare shoulders. That's when the screaming started. It was a single, piercing shriek that unlocked a tide of chaos. The elegant crowd transformed into a single, writhing organism of fear, surging toward the main doors, a logjam of silk and terror. Robert was shouting, his voice cracking, "Everyone stay calm." But his command was swallowed by the bedlam. He was a king whose subjects had just discovered he had no clothes. And that's when I moved. Not toward the exit with the herd, but deeper into the room, toward the source of the sound. I moved with a purpose that felt like a physical force, parting the chaos around me. I stopped directly beneath the main support beam, the one I had spent 3 nights analyzing, my fingers tracing its stress fractures like a doctor reading a fatal illness. Robert stumbled to a halt beside me, his breath catching. He looked from the jacks to the fractured beam, then back to me, his mind visibly struggling to reconcile the image. The crowd at the door murmured, their whispers echoing in the cavernous space. "I told you the support structure was compromised," I said, my voice low but carrying. I gestured to the jacks. "I did what your engineers failed to do. I found the precise points of failure, and I installed these temporary supports last night. I knew the combined weight of your celebration would be the final test. I hadn't just fixed a problem. I had engineered a scenario that proved my every warning correct and his every decision foolish. His money was useless down here. His influence meant nothing to the laws of physics. The only thing standing between his world and ruin was my foresight, my knowledge, my silent, secret work." I looked at him, holding his gaze, letting him see the calm certainty in my eyes. There was no gloating, no smirk. That would have been a hot, fleeting thing. What I felt was that same vast, subterranean satisfaction now surging up to fill the space between us. The debt wasn't just being called in. He was being forced to watch as I, the creditor, built the very stage upon which his insolvency was revealed. My eyes scanned the terrified, dust-streaked faces of the crowd until I found hers. Eleanor was pressed against the doorframe, her hand clamped over her mouth, her beautiful gown smudged with grey. Her eyes, wide with a fear she had never known, met mine. In that look, I saw the scrapyard, the furnace, every slight and every sneer. I saw her finally understand that the man who smelled of work was the only reason the beautiful, fragile world she curated hadn't just crumbled into rubble around her pearl-clad ears. The performance was flawless. The director was taking his bow. I let the silence stretch, a thick, heavy blanket smothering the last of the whimpers. All eyes were on me now, on the man in the work clothes who stood as still as the stone around him. I reached into my pocket, the movement slow and deliberate, and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. It was the original structural report, the one Robert had called alarmist and tossed onto a pile of unpaid invoices. I didn't hand it to him. I simply let it fall from my fingers. It fluttered to the floor between us, a white flag that was also a declaration of war. "The temporary jacks will hold for 48 hours, I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. It was simply a fact. You have my number. When you're ready to discuss a permanent solution and my terms, you know where to find me." They were no longer looking at me with pity or disdain. They were looking at me with a kind of awe, the kind reserved for forces of nature. I walked out of the ballroom, down the main hall, and out the front door into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of their shattered faces, of Robert's profound shame and Eleanor's terrified realization, was burned into the back of my eyelids. A masterpiece I would savor for a long, long time. The house stood for now, but their world had already collapsed, and I was the one standing in the wreckage, not buried by it, but finally, completely in control. I looked into her eyes, but this time there was no pain in mine, only a calm, patient certainty. I let her insult hang in the air, a final testament to her ignorance. And right on cue, as the weight of the guests, the piano, and the heavy marble centerpiece reached my calculated threshold, the first deep groan echoed from the floor beneath us. The party stopped. Her perfect moment was broken, not by the smell of my work, but by the sound of her own cheap compromise. It was a sound that didn't belong in that gilded cage, a low, visceral moan of tortured wood and overstressed steel. It was the house itself, finally giving voice to the cancer Robert's vanity had planted in its bones. The chatter died instantly, replaced by a silence so profound I could hear the ice melting in a forgotten champagne flute. Eleanor's face, frozen in a mask of smug contempt, began to fracture. Her eyes, which had just been slinging daggers at me, darted down towards the parquet floor as if it had suddenly turned to quicksand. Then came the second sound, sharper this time, a percussive crack from the direction of the grand piano. The pianist, his hands suspended over the keys, flinched and pulled them back as if bitten. A hairline fracture no thicker than a thread snaked its way up the pristine white wall behind him. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the room like a gust of wind. This was no settling noise. This was the sound of a foundation giving up. I didn't move. I was the still point in the turning world, the architect of this quiet apocalypse. I watched the understanding dawn on their faces, one by one. The initial confusion curdled into a dawning primal fear. They were pillars of society, but the actual pillars holding their temple aloft were failing. And the physics of the situation cared nothing for their stock portfolios or family names. Robert took a half step forward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His gaze met mine, and I saw the journey there, from anger at the disruption to annoyance at me, and finally, crashing into the horrifying realization of what the sounds meant. He remembered the report. He remembered my warnings, dismissed as the ravings of a tradesman trying to inflate a bill. The color drained from his face, leaving a waxy, pallid mask. His shame was a physical thing, a stench in the air fouler than any sweat or dirt I'd carried in with me. It was Eleanor who broke the spell of stunned silence. A high, thin whimper escaped her lips as the massive crystal chandelier above our heads gave a delicate, tinkling shudder, its 1,000 prisms whispering a panic of their own. Her hand, adorned with a diamond that could have paid for the necessary repairs 3 times over, flew to her throat. She wasn't looking at the crack in the wall or the trembling chandelier. She was looking at me, and in her eyes I saw the complete and utter demolition of her reality. I wasn't the ghost at the feast. I was the executioner. I had not come to beg. I had come to present the bill, and the house itself was collecting the debt. That's when I let the silence stretch, a thick, heavy blanket smothering the last of the whimpers. All eyes were on me now, on the man in the work clothes who stood as still as the stone around him. I reached into my pocket, the movement slow and deliberate, and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. It was the original structural report, the one Robert had called alarmist and tossed onto a pile of unpaid invoices. The paper was soft at the creases, smudged with the honest grime from my hands, a stark contrast to the crisp, cream-colored programs for the evening's performance. I didn't hand it to him. I simply let it fall from my fingers. It fluttered, a lazy, taunting leaf to the floor between us, a white flag that was also a declaration of war. It landed face up, the bold, underlined word condemned clearly visible. "The temporary jacks will hold for 48 hours, I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. It was simply a fact, more solid and real than anything else in the crumbling room. You have my number. When you're ready to discuss a permanent solution, and my terms, you know where to find me." I could feel their gazes on my back, but I didn't hurry. My boots were loud on the parquet, each step a period at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for years. I walked out of the ballroom, down the main hall with its portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch my retreat with a newfound approval, and out the front door into the cool, clean night air. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of their shattered faces, of Robert's profound shame and Eleanor's terrified realization, was burned into the back of my eyelids, a masterpiece I would savor for a long, long time. The night air was a baptism. I filled my lungs with it, the scent of damp earth and distant rain washing the cloying perfume and fear out of me. I stood on the gravel driveway, the stones crunching softly under my weight, a solid, trustworthy sound. Behind me, the house stood for now, a beautiful, broken shell. But their world, their carefully constructed illusion of unshakable superiority, had already collapsed. And I was the one standing in the wreckage, not buried by it, but finally, completely, in control. I got into my truck, the engine roaring to life, a vulgar, triumphant sound in the hushed night. I drove away without a single glance in the rearview mirror. Let them stare at the cracks. My work here was done. The silence that followed my pronouncement was more profound than any scream. It was a vacuum, sucking the air, the sound, the very soul out of the grand ballroom. For a single suspended moment, all that existed was the blueprint in my hands, the damning signature I pointed to, and the collective horrified gaze of 100 people fixed on Eleanor. Then, the floor groaned. It wasn't the sharp crack of breaking timber I'd expected, but a low, deep-throated moan, the sound a great beast makes in its death throes. It was the house itself, finally giving voice to the cancer Eleanor had planted in its bones. The chandelier above me, that monstrous confection of crystal and electric candle, shivered, its 1,000 pendants tinkling a panicked crystalline melody. Panic, held at bay by sheer disbelief, finally broke its leash. A woman shrieked, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the sudden tide of movement. The orderly retreat to the walls dissolved into a chaotic scramble. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than my truck shoved past each other, their eyes wide with a primal fear. They weren't afraid of social embarrassment anymore. They were afraid of the very ground beneath their feet giving way. And I stood in the center of it all, an island of absolute calm in the storm of their making. My phone was still in my hand, Sal's voice a tinny, frantic buzz from the speaker. Kid, what's happening? Was that a..." She was watching her life's work, not just the house, but the reputation, the social standing, the meticulously crafted illusion of her impeccable taste. Collapse, in real time. Robert stood beside her, his hand on her arm, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at me, his expression a complicated ruin of shame, fury, and a dawning, horrifying respect. "The main support beam under the central dais," I said into the phone, for the benefit of everyone listening. The one she specified should be replaced with laminated veneer lumber to make room for that ridiculous heating vent. Tell me what's about to happen. A hairline fracture appeared in the plaster of the ceiling directly below the ballroom, a black vein against the white. A fine dust of plaster sifted down like snow onto the heads of the fleeing guests. That was all it took. The stampede began in earnest. The double doors, once a symbol of grand entrances, became a bottleneck of terrified humanity. Silk ripped. Glass from a dropped champagne flute shattered under a frantic heel. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat and fear overriding the cloying perfume. I slowly, deliberately, rolled up the blueprint. It was my baton, my proof. I tucked it securely inside my jacket, against my chest. It felt like a shield. I turned my back on the spectacle and began to walk. My exit was everything. I walked through the crowd, which parted for me as if I were Moses. They were no longer looking at me with pity or disdain. They were looking at me with a kind of awe, the kind reserved for forces of nature, earthquakes and tidal waves. A path cleared from me to the double doors, a corridor of terrified respect. I could feel their gazes on my back, but I didn't hurry. My boots were loud on the parquet, each step a period at the end of a sentence I'd been writing for years. I walked out of the ballroom, down the main hall with its portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch my retreat with a newfound approval, and out the front door into the cool, clean night air. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of their shattered faces, of Robert's profound shame and Eleanor's terrified realization, was burned into the back of my eyelids, a masterpiece I would savor for a long, long time. The night air was a baptism. I filled my lungs with it, the scent of damp earth and distant rain washing the cloying perfume and fear out of me. I stood on the gravel driveway, the stones crunching softly under my weight, a solid, trustworthy sound. Behind me, the house stood for now, a beautiful, broken shell. But their world, their carefully constructed illusion of unshakable superiority, had already collapsed, and I was the one standing in the wreckage, not buried by it, but finally, completely, in control. I got into my truck, the engine roaring to life, a vulgar, triumphant sound in the hushed night. I drove away without a single glance in the rearview mirror. Let them stare at the cracks. My work here was done. The first drops of rain began to fall, smearing the world outside my windshield. I drove on autopilot, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It wasn't the fatigue of a single night's work, but the weariness of a decade-long war finally concluded. I found myself not at my cramped apartment, but pulling into the dim, oil-stained lot of Sal's Salvage and Repair. The yard was a graveyard of broken things, a chaotic sculpture garden of rusted metal and forgotten machinery. Under the lone security light, the rain gleamed on the twisted fender of an old Cadillac. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen all night. I killed the engine and just sat for a moment, listening to the rain drum a gentle rhythm on the truck's roof. The silence was a physical presence, warm and welcoming. Then, the office door creaked open, and Sal stepped out, silhouetted against the warm light from within. He held 2 mugs. He didn't wave me in. He just stood there, a solid, unchanging figure in a world I had just set spinning off its axis. I got out of the truck and walked toward him. The gravel here was different from the Vanderbilt's driveway, larger, mixed with dirt, real. He handed me a mug. The smell of cheap, strong coffee hit me, a scent more familiar and comforting than any vintage champagne. For a long minute, we just stood there under the awning listening to the rain, drinking our coffee. The only sound was the steady drip from the gutter and the distant hum of the highway. "So?" he finally grunted, his voice rough as gravel. "Did the foundation hold? Now you can build something new." I didn't wait for applause or for the stunned silence to curdle into something uglier. I just walked out. Past the frozen caterers, past the grand piano that was probably the next thing to go, and out into the cleansing chill of the rain. The drive back to the city was a blur of neon smears on wet asphalt, my hands steady on the wheel while my mind replayed the collapse in their eyes. It was a victory, I supposed, but it felt hollow. A sugar rush high that was already fading, leaving a metallic taste of ashes in my mouth, which is why I found myself not at my cramped apartment, but pulling into the dim, oil-stained lot of Sal's Salvage and Repair. The yard was a graveyard of broken things, a chaotic sculpture garden of rusted metal and forgotten machinery. Under the lone security light, the rain gleamed on the twisted fender of an old Cadillac. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen all night. I killed the engine and just sat for a moment, listening to the rain drum a gentle rhythm on the truck's roof. The silence was a physical presence, warm and welcoming. Then, the office door creaked open, and Sal stepped out, silhouetted against the warm light from within. He held 2 mugs. He didn't wave me in. He just stood there, a solid, unchanging figure in a world I had just set spinning off its axis. I got out of the truck and walked toward him. The gravel here was different from the Vanderbilt's driveway, larger, mixed with dirt, real. He handed me a mug. The smell of cheap, strong coffee hit me, a scent more familiar and comforting than any vintage champagne. For a long minute, we just stood there under the awning listening to the rain, drinking our coffee. The only sound was the steady drip from the gutter and the distant hum of the highway. "So?" he finally grunted, his voice rough as gravel. "Did the foundation hold?" I followed. The room was a cluttered sanctuary of grime and order. Parts catalogs were stacked neatly next to a half-dissected carburetor. The air smelled of oil, coffee, and old wood. He gestured with his chin toward a battered armchair in the corner, its springs sighing in protest as I sat. He leaned against his cluttered desk, folding his arms. "Tell me," he said. It wasn't a request for details. It was a command to exorcise the ghost. And so I did. The words came out in a quiet torrent. The impossible weight of the sculpture, the hairline fractures snaking up from the basement, the way Eleanor Vanderbilt's smile had tightened into a rictus of panic as I laid it all bare. I told him about the jacks, the satisfying final thud that stole the breath from the room. "I broke it, Sal," I finished, the hollowness returning. "I proved my point. I used everything you ever taught me, and I broke their whole damn world in front of them. You think I feel bad for the cars out there?" He jerked his thumb toward the yard. They had their time. They served their purpose. Some blew a gasket, some wrapped themselves around a pole. They're not tragedies. They're just done. The tragedy is letting a thing that's done pretend it's still running until it fails catastrophically and hurts someone. "So what now?" I asked, the coffee's warmth seeping into my bones. "What do you build after you've just torn down the only blueprint you've ever known?" "Start with the basics." As I traced a faulty connection, the memory of the Vanderbilt house didn't sting anymore. It just felt distant, like a story about someone else. Here, in the humming silence of the salvage yard, with the rain now easing to a soft patter, I wasn't the destroyer of worlds, or the failed scion of a crumbling dynasty. I was just a pair of hands that could fix things. And for the first time in a long time, the foundation beneath my own feet felt solid, permanent, and entirely my own. The old life was a stripped chassis, ready to be hauled away. And this, the smell of oil and the promise of a working motor, this was the new ground. I watched from a distance as her guests departed, their silence more damning than any outburst. The grand rooms, once filled with laughter and easy flattery, stood empty. In the days that followed, the invitations ceased, the phone did not ring, and the house on the hill became a quiet, gleaming monument. I saw her once, standing alone at her vast window, a solitary figure against the glass, and I knew the foundation had crumbled. I didn't linger to watch the final act. There was no satisfaction in it, only the hollow ache of a necessary surgery. The phantom limb of my old life was gone, cleanly amputated. I drove back to the salvage yard as the last of the evening light bled from the sky, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold against the grimy windshield of my truck. The chaos of the yard, the skeletal frames of cars, the mountains of tires, the quiet sentinels of forgotten appliances, felt more like home than any gilded room ever had. Sal was waiting for me, not with questions but with a cold bottle of beer and a nod toward the Kenmore. Its innards were still spread across the workbench like a patient mid-surgery. "Motor's fixed," I said, the words feeling more significant than they were. I'd replaced the worn-out capacitor, rewound a section of the coil, and restored the flow of power. A simple, tangible victory. "I know," he grunted, taking a long pull from his bottle. "Heard it hum from the office. Sounds good. Steady." "She's finished," I said, the statement dropping between us like a stone. I didn't need to say who. Sal just nodded again, his eyes, old and knowing, fixed on the dark horizon. "Some structures aren't worth salvaging. The foundation's rotten. You can't patch that with new drywall and a fresh coat of paint. You did what you had to do. Now you've got clean land to build on." He gestured with his bottle, encompassing the entire yard, the workbench, the humming washing machine. "This is your land now." There was no dread coiling in my stomach, no performance to prepare for. There was only work. Sal had a new project for me. Not an appliance, but a machine. A 1963 Hammond M102 organ, its once glorious walnut veneer, scarred and water-stained. Its keyboard, a grinning row of yellowed teeth. It had been rescued from a church that was being torn down. "It's a beast," Sal said, slapping its side. "Tubes and transformers, a tone wheel generator. It's more clock than radio. Think you can handle it?" I pulled out the heavy chassis, labeled every wire with meticulous care, cleaned the decades of dust from the tone wheels with a soft brush and pure alcohol. I learned the language of this machine, the hum of the generator, the click of the drawbars, the way the sound was born from spinning steel and magnetic pickups. My world shrank to the space between the bench and the organ, a universe defined by solvable problems. A cracked wire needed soldering, a sluggish key needed lubrication, a dead tube needed replacing. There was no ambiguity, no subtext. The machine didn't care about my name, my past, or my failures. It only responded to competence. And with every connection I restored, every circuit I brought back to life, I felt a parallel reconstruction happening within myself. I was rewiring my own soul, replacing the fragile, ornamental parts with something solid, something functional. One evening, after replacing the final preamp tube, I carefully slid the chassis back into the organ's cabinet. I plugged it in, my heart thudding with a nervous anticipation I hadn't felt since my first society gala. But this was different. This was real. I flipped the switch. A low, warm hum filled the space, the sound of power flowing through restored pathways. I pressed a key. Middle C. The note that bloomed from the speaker was rich, deep, and alive, vibrating through the floorboards and up into my bones. It was the most honest sound I had ever heard. I didn't play a song. I just held the note, letting its resonance fill the workshop, feeling it cleanse the last of the ghosts from the air. Sal appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, a rare, full smile on his face. "Listen to that," he said softly. "You didn't just fix it, you brought it back to life." The final walkthrough had been a surreal, quiet affair. I'd expected a pang of loss, a final, painful twinge as I handed over the keys to a life I'd worked decades to build. But as I'd closed the heavy oak door for the last time, all I felt was the satisfying, definitive click of a latch. It was over. The transaction was complete, not just for the property, but for the ghost of the man who used to live there. My new place was small, solid, and unassuming. A brick bungalow on a street where people grew tomatoes in their front yards and fixed their own gutters. The garage, a detached single-bay structure with a cracked concrete floor and windows that needed putty, was my sanctuary. It smelled of sawdust, warm metal, and ozone. In the center, where a car might have been, sat the Hammond organ, its wooden cabinet scarred but glowing with a recent polish. It was no longer a patient. It was a companion. My son, Mark, was there with me, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the memory of his last visit to the old house. He'd come to help me move the last of my things, the real things, my toolbox, the organ, a few boxes of books. He'd been quiet, observant, his gaze lingering on my hands, which were now permanently etched with ground-in grease and a network of fine, healed-over cuts. "I can't believe you got this thing working," he'd said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty garage. He'd tentatively pressed a key, and the rich, warm chord that answered made him startle. "It just needed someone to listen to it," I'd replied. Now he was looking at a different project. I'd salvaged the wrought iron railing from the old house's back porch, the one his mother had always loved. It was twisted and rusted in one section where a large planter had fallen years ago. I'd promised her I'd fix it. I never had. "It's beyond saving, isn't it?" Mark asked, running a hand over the flaking orange metal. "Nothing is beyond saving," I said, the words coming out with a conviction that felt earned. "It just needs to be redefined. We're not restoring it, we're rebuilding it, stronger." His hands, so accustomed to the soft tap of a keyboard, were clumsy with the heavy gloves. I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the fear of the bright, dangerous flame. "Here," I said, my voice low and steady. I moved behind him, my shadow enveloping his. I placed my calloused, leathery hand over his, guiding his grip on the torch. My touch was firm, not to control, but to steady. I felt the fine bones of his wrist, so like his mother's, and the latent strength in his forearm. "It's all about a steady hand and a clear intention. You're not just melting metal, you're fusing it, making two separate pieces into one inseparable thing. I could feel the concentration vibrating through him, the slight tremble in his arm giving way to a focused stillness. He was learning the language of force and fusion, a vocabulary written in light and heat. When we pulled back, lowering our masks, a bead of new, silvery metal gleamed in the join, ugly and beautiful in its raw strength. It was a scar, but a strong one. A repair that acknowledged the break but refused to be defined by it. Mark looked from the welded joint to his hands, then to me. The look in his eyes wasn't just respect, it was recognition. He was seeing me, perhaps for the first time, not as the provider of a lifestyle, but as a maker of tangible, enduring things. I had lost a house, a fortune, a position. But in losing it all, I had finally been able to show him who I was. I had reclaimed my dignity. It wasn't a gift or an inheritance. It was something I had built piece by piece with these two hands. My worth was not in the clean clothes I wore, but in the strength of the things I built and the integrity of the man I had always been, buried for years under a mountain of obligations and expectations. Later, after Mark had left with a promise to return next weekend to finish the railing, I sat in the garage as dusk settled. I didn't turn on the main light, just the small lamp on the workbench. I powered up the Hammond. The warm hum filled the space, a sound that was becoming the bedrock of my new life. I didn't play a melody, just clusters of chords, letting them bloom and decay in the quiet air. The sound was solid. It was functional. It was true. The hollow feeling was gone, not just patched over, but filled in from the ground up. The old life wasn't a stripped chassis anymore, waiting to be hauled away. It was raw material, scrap, and I was finally learning what to build with it. The foundation wasn't just solid now, it was singing. And in that resonant, quiet moment, surrounded by the ghosts of broken things I had made whole, I was finally, completely at peace.